John Hick. That is a very famous little excerpt, by the way. It's found in a lot of anthologies on this subject. Now, the other essay is the person who makes the claim that a perfect God cannot be defended in the face of evil. That is argued by B.C. Johnson. If you are writing this essay, hint, hint, these two essays here should be what? They should be focal points. They should be focal points. Now, the reason I do my essays in this course this way, I am not doing research essays. Number one, it presupposes that you already understand philosophy enough to know what's good research and what isn't. And I think it would be unfair for me to do that. That's why I have selected the two readings that you will be analyzing and thinking about the arguments presented by each. And then doing your best to figure out which arguments are stronger, which ones are weaker, and start to think about the flaws in particular arguments. And by the way, it is no sin to come to this conclusion in philosophy. I'm not sure. This is something that has been debated for almost 1,000 years. And we still don't have clear-cut answers. So to think that you're going to come up with a clear-cut answer now in circa 2017 might be overextending on your brilliance. That's no insult to you, because if it's an insult to you, it's also an insult to me. But yeah, I won't claim to have the answers. But I will admit I should say, I can meaningfully talk about my inability to give you answers. Anyway, just wanted to talk about that first. We collected homework for today. Any last questions about Stoicism before we leave that entirely? Now remember that Stoicism claims that ultimate reality is this thing called the Logos. The Logos often is a word that translates directly to God, but it is very different from the average Joe American's perspective on what God is. The Logos is not this. The Logos is not anthropomorphic. He's not a big man in the clouds who loves you tenderly and wants to wrap his great big beautiful arms around you. That harkens back to a Sunday school song, I remember. You know, it's a great big wonderful God. You know, how many of you know what I'm talking about? We got a great big wonderful God. Something and glorious, something and something. Great big wonderful God. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, this God is not anthropomorphic. In other words, he does not have human qualities. And even using the word he is a misnomer. Perfectly rational. And remember, things that are perfectly rational would look at everything how if it was looking. Because to talk about looking, it implies eyes, so don't take this language literally. You remember, everything through the divine eye is seen as good and in its place. No thing is more important than anything else. Now, the Logos does love us, insofar as the Logos, quote unquote, loves all things. And you might remember that according to their account, everything happens for a cosmic purpose. So on one hand, you are what? On one hand, you are radically insignificant, but on the other hand, you are also radically significant. Now that might seem oxymoronic. How can I be both insignificant and significant simultaneously? Well, the idea is, this is the whole. Suppose this circle is the whole of reality. You are but a what? Bing! You are but a tiny pinpoint in the fabric of reality. On that hand, you might seem very insignificant. But as Stoicism would put it, every single little point has some bit part to play. Simply because it's a bit part does not mean that it's not important. You did not choose your role either. But no matter for that, according to Stoicism, what? You ought to carry it out. For Stoicism, the purpose of life is doing what? It is doing your duty. And unlike hedonism, remember hedonism says that in the end, you ought to seek pleasure and try to avoid pain as best you can. That is the road to quote-unquote happiness. Stoicism does not make happiness in that sense the ends of life. The ends of life is to be the best that you can be at the small role that you have been given to play out. You're actually important according to this view, even in your radical smallness in the end of the game. And you should take solace in this. They also spoke of the language of how the Logos cares about us. But remember, that's not a filial kind of caring. It's more like an abstract caring, and if I can put a word on the board, Christians in the audience should have heard this word. It's not in the text. This will apply for this chapter and the next. How many of you have heard the word agape, or you might hear it pronounced agape? It is one of a half dozen Greek words for what? It is one of a half dozen Greek words for love. However, agape is a rather peculiar kind of love. And I joked about it last week, you might recall. If I told my wife that I loved her in this way, if she had any sense at all, she'd already have the divorce papers drawn up. Because this is not the kind of love we want from people who are family or are our spouse. A normal spouse would want several other kinds of love. Filial love, and probably what other kind of love? I don't know if I'm allowed to say it on film. Oh, it's what we call eros. Also, filial love as well as eros. But if I told my wife, I've got this divine kind of love for you. It's called agape. I love you just as I love the rest of the cosmos. I love all things equally. And my love is outpouring, but it's not that kind of weird, useless eros that you speak of. It is sort of an abstract love for all things at all times. Now, the reason why I say it's an abstract kind of love is because when you hear about this thing, most people can't what? Most people can't fathom it. They cannot get their heads around it because it doesn't sound like anything that we think of as love. But Christians are oftentimes told that this is the kind of love that God has for all things. It is a dispassionate love, and it is this. It is radically impartial. It does not play favorites. It does not play favorites. Now, this is kind of the way that the Stoics saw the relationship between the Logos and we, the bit players. Sort of had a dispassionate sort of love for the whole. Dispassionate love for all of the parts. And this is why they argue that the Logos never throws anything at you that you can't handle. And the things that you can handle, even though they are terrible loads to bear when you're undergoing them, They're for what? They're for your good, but they're also for the good of the whole. Because oftentimes, life's travails are the things that can bring out the best in us, but they also enable us to better minister to other people. That's the kind of thinking here. This is why Epictetus, who lived most of his life as a what? A slave. His motto was bear and forbear. Through his courage and his fortitude, he eventually won his freedom. He took on students, and he was able to teach a large number of people Stoic wisdom. And by the way, many people have found Stoic wisdom, if not to be accurate, at least to be sometimes useful. Because there are insights that can certainly help to get us through what we call hard times. There are insights that can help us to get through hard times. And as the wrap up here, some of you may have noticed some of you wrote the question. Near the end of the chapter, there is a discussion of James Bond Stockdale. Now, many of you who are considerably younger than me do not remember Stockdale. I do. He was H. Ross Perot's running mate in 1992. Most of you were not. Actually, I bet none of you were born at that time. I'd be willing to... You were born...
92.
You were born in 92?
89.
89? Wow! I wouldn't have guessed. Well, I'll just say I was born way earlier than 89. So I was an adult, well, vaguely adult at that point. So I remember him. He was H. Ross Perot's running mate. Now, he went to one of the military service academies, and on the reading list was Epictetus. He, of course, wondered why military people would have to take a course in philosophy. Aren't we learning about tactics and things of this nature? Well, he found out the hard way that philosophical ideas can be highly practical. When he was a POW, he found that the teachings of Epictetus came in handy for him, because it was the one time in a relatively privileged life that he found out what about his life and all of our lives. Most of what befalls us is outside of our control. And we are best off if we understand that and accept that. He also makes reference, and this is in the book, to what biblical figure? And I sometimes like to joke, this is the most philosophical book in the Bible. It takes on the problem of evil, by the way. You may have seen that he mentions the book of Job, and that's mentioned in the textbook. I want to talk about that now, in part because it is also relevant to our discussion of the problem of evil in the next unit. I hope some of you have read the book of Job. Religious or not, it is worth reading. Historians believe that it is the oldest book of the Bible. And it probably did not come from Jewish mythology. It probably originally came from Persian, stories. But at the beginning of the story, God is talking with whom? God is talking with Satan at the beginning. God is talking about his loyal servant Job, and how great of a servant of God Job is. Satan asks him a few questions, and God takes the bait. He says, well, it's no wonder he's your loyal servant. Look at all the things you bestowed on him. He's got riches. He comes from a good house. He doesn't have to worry for anything. I guarantee you that if all of his favors are taken from him, he will curse you. God takes the bait, and he says, I will let you do anything to him, as long as you don't do what? Don't kill him. And let's just say that Job goes through very miserable times. And perhaps one of the saddest parts, there's tons of sad parts, but when his friends are talking to him, one of them suggests to him that he must have done something really, really awful to deserve this. Very frequently, what bad inference do we make about people who suffer in this world?
They must have done something bad.
Yeah, they must have done something horrible to deserve it. That's not what the book of Job says. That's also not what Stoicism says. Because at the beginning it said that Job was the one man who was completely righteous in the eyes of God. So the original sin argument won't wash here. Job was a good man and righteous in the eyes of God. Now the tragedies befell him because of something totally out of his control. It was allowed to happen to him. Now, of course, one of his quote-unquote friends, says, well, you must have done something really bad, assuming that anyone who suffers deserves it. I think many people think that, but when you start to question people on it, nobody really believes it. My mother did not deserve to get cancer twice. And I'm not just speaking that way because she's my mom. She's a good, upstanding Christian. She's served God all of her life, and she's been incredibly long-suffering. Her one sin might be vanity, which is arguably what Job's sin was. Because to believe that you're good in the eyes of God is already what? Is already pride. Is already vanity. So yeah, if she is sinful, it might be the sin of vanity. Oh, she also likes to judge. What am I talking about? Like so many religious people whom I know, no offense to anyone, to present company, they like to talk about how everyone else is a sinner. Have you ever, you know what I'm talking about? They go, well, I'm a sinner too. I'm just not as bad a sinner as you are. If you read the big book, I believe all our sinners is in there, and you're not supposed to be differentiating. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But yeah, Stockdale references Job. There was nothing in particular he had done to deserve anything that befell him. And that's just the what? That's just the way things are, ladies and gentlemen. Life isn't quote-unquote fair. Perhaps it is our expectation that life ought to be fair. But that's not to accept life on its terms. I know that in the grand scheme of things, I am more fortunate than probably 99% of the people who have ever walked this planet. At least materially speaking. I am more fortunate than 99% of the human life that has ever walked on this planet. And I certainly don't deserve it. They are accidents of what? Accidents of time and place. Merely that. Accidents of time and place. That's part of the reason why Stoicism would say, you shouldn't be boastful and think that you deserve your fortunes. You also should recognize that your calamities aren't necessarily what either?
Your own doing.
Are not necessarily your own doing either. But that doesn't mean, and this is going to sound American, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your duty and buck up. You've heard that phrase. In other words, deal with it. Even if your sufferings are not your own fault, it is still yours to deal with. Even if you didn't choose your lot in life, It is a self-defeating proposal to cry about it. And if you are going to cry about it, get it over with quickly and then get on with it. That's sort of the attitude here. That's the attitude here. And you'll notice it can lead one to have the Stoic virtue of fortitude, inner strength. The inner strength, to as Epictetus put it, bear and forbear. And I see this in a lot of my religious friends. This belief that everything happens for a purpose. That's a Stoic idea, but you find that in many religious traditions too. Now, of course, people need to believe this. Or I should say some people, many people need to believe this. Why? It's one of the ways, oh, Marazzo, yeah.
Because if there's no purpose, what's the point?
Yeah, and I would add, it's one of the attitudes that people have that helps them to get through. You say, well, this must be happening for a reason. It also tells you as a person that you what? You matter in some sense. To say that everything happens for a purpose is also to sort of articulate that you matter in some sense. Maybe even a cosmic sense. Even if you're smart, even if your part in the cosmic sense is this big, it still effectively says that you do matter. To say that everything happens for a purpose. Now, of course, to say that everything happens for a purpose is also to say that these purposes may not be whose. Yeah, they may not be our own. And that those are the kinds of things that we sometimes just have to deal with, accept it. And the sooner that you accept it, the sooner you'll be able to, with fortitude, get on with it or deal with it. Any last questions before I go to the next chapter? Click. All right. Timekeeper?
That's 24.
Yeah.
What, 24?
Yeah.
Good. Brilliant. We're going to be discussing Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8, ladies and gentlemen. The larger chapter pertains to St. Thomas Aquinas, although we will be talking about some other figures along the way. One of those other figures we'll be discussing along the way will be... We'll also be making mention of St. Augustine, and I'll also be referencing, in the course of the next 2 lectures, those arguments for theodicy by John Hick. So if you haven't read those already, I strongly encourage you to. And those arguments contra theodicy made by B.C. Johnson. Now, as preliminary, folks, I wanted to note that there is a temporal gap from our discussion of the Stoics to the time period of St. Thomas Aquinas. What period roughly was Stoicism? The late Greek period and the early Roman period. So we're talking pre-200 of the Common Era. Now, when does St. Thomas and the likes of St. Thomas come to the map? We're talking after 1000 of the Common Era. We're talking a 750-year plus gap. Where did the time all go? Well, this is that period that you might learn about in a history class. That is sometimes called what?
The Dark Ages.
Thank you. Yeah, That gap in between is the so-called Dark Ages. And by the way, the Dark Ages were not always quite as dark as they're sometimes portrayed in a history survey course. Now, some of the things that happened on the way to the Dark Ages were this. The Roman Empire ends up declining. And keep in mind, for all the horrors of empire, there are certain goods that come of things like the Roman Empire. One of them is, I'm sure you talked about this, when there is a relatively large and relatively stable society, not only is there a huge ability for economic exchange to take place, and that includes things like travel and trade, but what other kind of exchange also takes place? Thank you. I'm also talking about intellectual exchange. And it was under the Roman Empire, that these kinds of things, at least for a time, flourished. Now, as the empire declines, and people's economic prospects decline along with it, and of course, along the road to this happening, what also becomes official? Christianity eventually becomes not just legal, but it eventually becomes what? It becomes the official state religion eventually. And by the way, it's not always good when something becomes an official state religion, because oftentimes it can end up taking on a totally new character, and it can also be used for nefarious ends by the powerful. And I think you probably might understand what that might mean in our American context. Think of how much religion is used coercively, and you get the idea. And I'm pretty cynical about it, I admit. I've been around long enough to grow very cynical about these things. But anyway, I don't want to play on that point too much. Now, in the very beginnings of Christianity, the text unfortunately doesn't talk about this,